Yeah, so after World War One, they just took back the land that were historically theirs, is what it seems like he's saying. And Poland, because they were so standfast, they got parts of Germany back once the war was over.
Mr. President, thank you. On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable series.
Tucker's laugh, he just it just tickles me inside. His laugh is so it's so like ridiculous that it's charming at the same time.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history.
I didn't know Tucker went to school. Is his bachelor? Does he have a bachelor's or a master's? Does he have a bachelor's in history?
For giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from? The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood, and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign. In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country.
Did he say 862 or did he mean 1862? Because it wasn't always Russia as we know it today. Let's keep listening.
In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's young son, because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev. He ousted two brothers who apparently had once been members of Rurik's squad.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know about you guys, but it's pretty hard to keep track of with the translator in the background talking. So I don't know how Tucker is doing that, but it's already hard for me to keep track.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod. The next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988. This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity. From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties, one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule.
Oh, I know what he's doing. He is laying out, I guess, not just the reason why he invaded Ukraine, but I guess that he's saying they all come from one, and maybe that there should be return to one. I don't know if it's exactly he's exactly saying that it was because NATO was pushing up against his border. I think it's more of a I don't want to say philosophical, but I guess a history context that based on historical terms that Ukraine belongs as a part of Russia. That's what I'm getting.
Of the prince. the centralized Russian state began to take shape. Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
Also, I guess this is why Tucker was saying that he started to ramble a little bit and he had to interrupt him.
But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons. The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines. All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state. There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe. But the fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan. His successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty. They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty. And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow. The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev, began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe. This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was even called the Lithuanian Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population. They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox. But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. A few years later, another union was signed, but this time already in the religious sphere. Some of the Orthodox priests became subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state. During decades,
Is he trying to argue that Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and basically all of Eastern Europe was all a part of Russia? Because that's what it seems like to me. But I don't know the history of Russia and the formation of the Soviet Union and the destructuring of it and then now into Russia. So I'm just letting him keep talking until I can figure it out at least.
the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population. They introduced a language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians. Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that the person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group. So the Poles were trying to...
Okay. So I guess those ethnic groups I'm jumping the gun, but I guess the ethnic groups that he's saying that used to patrol the border, and granted, like I said, I don't know if any of this is true, but we're going to take it off face value. The people that were doing the border patrol, I guess, accumulated enough people to, I guess, form a revolt at some point, then eventually turned into Ukraine to give them some kind of sovereignty.
In every possible way to colonize this part of the Russian lands, and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights. They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, could you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century. Now I will tell you what happened later and give the dates so that there is no confusion. And in 1654, even a bit earlier, The people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away. So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents.
Well,
Oh, he got the receipts. 'Cause like I said, he could just be saying anything. I don't know. I'm not of Russian descent. I've never even been to that side of the country or the world. So what do I know? I guess he's about to provide Tucker the receipts.
it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
But still, these are documents from the archives, copies. Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian lands that is now called Ukraine. He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld. And after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory.
Okay, so it seems like Ukraine before they were known as currently Ukraine, the current Ukraine, that they were under the thumb of Poland, is what it seems like. They wanted to get out from under Poland, so they reached out to Moscow to help liberate them from the stronghold that Poland had over them. And he's trying to show Tucker the documents to prove that he's essentially not lying.
There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later. Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the pan-Russian assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar, which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654, a truce was concluded. And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty which they called Eternal Peace was signed. And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland. Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west. This all lasted until the revolution. Before World War I, Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization. Their motive was obvious. Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area. So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared. All those, however, claimed that Ukraine should have a very good relationship with Russia. They insisted on that. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood and the civil war began, including the hostilities with Poland. In 1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland. In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, It did collaborate with Hitler, you know? Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship. An alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg.
This is a long way to just say that Ukraine belongs to us because we helped them get their revolution. Is what it seems like. I don't because his story is so long-winded. It seems like he's just coming to the conclusion that based throughout history, Russia has always supported Ukraine, and because they have supported Ukraine and provided them with resources, that they belong to them. But he said because earlier he said that they sent Russian soldiers or people to guard the border were sent out to these lands, and that's how these distant lands, and that's how Ukraine came to be. So that's just my opinion.
After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Dansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course.
Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear.
Yeah, that's a good question because if you're going to make this long-winded arguments, saying that historically Ukraine belonged to you, you could have just down with whatever treaty or whatever sovereign lines that they had and almost immediately taken it over. He sure wouldn't have got as much backlash as he's gotten right now.
Nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
Sure. I'll tell you.
It's a good question.
I'm coming to that. This briefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but it explains many things.
I just don't know how it's relevant.
Good. Good. I'm so gratified that you appreciate that. Thank you. So, before World War II, Poland collaborated with Hitler, and although it did not yield to Hitler's demands, it still participated in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia, together with Hitler, as the Poles had not given the Danzig corridor to Germany and went too far, pushing Hitler to start World War II by attacking them. Why was it Poland against whom the war started on 1st September 1939? Poland turned out to be uncompromising, and Hitler had nothing to do but start implementing his plans with Poland. By the way, the USSR, I have read some archived documents, behaved very honestly. It asked Poland's permission to transit its troops through the Polish territory to help Czechoslovakia. But the then Polish foreign minister said that if the Soviet planes flew over Poland, they would be down over the territory of Poland. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the war began, and Poland fell prey to the policies it had pursued against Czechoslovakia, is under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Part of the territory, including Western Ukraine, was to be given to Russia. Thus, Russia, which was then named as USSR, regained its historical lands. After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II, all those territories were ultimately enshrined as belonging to Russia, to the USSR. As for Poland, it received, apparently in compensation, the lands which had originally been German. The eastern parts of Germany, these are now western lands of Poland. Of course, Poland regained access to the Baltic Sea and Danzig.
I didn't know Poland was so powerful before World War One. I mean, I took AP government and I took a bunch of, traditional public school history courses, and I didn't know Poland was so stand fast in their stance to, I guess, Hitler when he was before he went on the war terror. I mean, I'm sure camps like concentration camps had already existed. Um, but yeah, so after World War I, they just took back the land that were historically theirs. Is what he seems like he's saying. And Poland, because they were so standfast, they got parts of Germany back once the war was over.
which was once again given its Polish name. So this was how this situation developed. In 1922, when the USSR was being established, the Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before. Right. Stalin insisted that those republics be included in the USSR as autonomous entities. For some inexplicable reason, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they be entitled to withdraw from the USSR. And again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine, and yet they were made part of that Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Those lands included the Black Sea region, which was received under Catherine the Great, and which had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever. Even if we go as far back as 1654, when these lands returned to Russian Empire, that territory was the size of 3 to 4 regions of modern Ukraine, with no Black Sea region. That was completely out of the question.
In 1654.
Exactly.
You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of this region, but why didn't you make this case for the first 22 years as president that Ukraine wasn't a real country?
That's a good question. And he's like jumping back and forth hundreds of years to try to establish this point that Tucker seems like he has no awareness of, and it's going to be hard to follow and even develop questions when you're giving such a vast amount of information in such a short period of time. Tucker's probably trying to ingest the information and then form a reasonable question relating back to the whole reason that he's in Russia in the first place, which I'd imagine, all things considered, all the other factors that are in the situation he's in Russia, trying not to be disrespectful, but also be inquisitive and give a good interview at the same time.
The Soviet Union was given a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region. At some point, when Russia received them as an outcome of the Russo-Turkish Wars, they were called New Russia or Novorossiya. But that does not matter. What matters is that Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, established Ukraine that way. For decades, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic developed as part of the USSR. And for unknown reasons, again, the Bolsheviks were engaged in Ukrainianization. It was not merely because the Soviet leadership was composed to a great extent of those originating from Ukraine. Rather, it was explained by the general policy of indigenization pursued by the Soviet Union. Same things were done in other Soviet republics. This involved promoting national languages and national cultures, which is not a bad in principle. That is how the Soviet Ukraine was created. After the World War II, Ukraine received, in addition to the lands that had belonged to Poland before the war, part of the lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania. So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine, and they still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take
lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania? So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine, and they still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question because if he says yes to that, then all these other countries that are surrounding Ukraine has a right to also invade and demand their piece of the land back that was redistributed after World War II.
I'm not sure whether they should go back to the 1654 borders. But given Stalin's time, so-called Stalin's regime, which, as many claim, saw numerous violations of human rights and violations of the rights of other states,
В этом смысле, конечно, вполне можно, если не говорить о том, что они имеют на это право.
one may say that they could claim back those lands of theirs while having no right to do that. It is at least understandable.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine?
Никогда не говорил.
Never. I have never told him that.
Okay. Yeah, see, see, that's what I'm saying. If he is going to invade and take Ukraine, then Hungary and the other countries that formed Ukraine also have a right to their land back if that's the argument that he's going to use to invade them. So that's a good ass question.
Not a single time.
У нас с ним даже на этот счет нет разговора. Он достоверно.
We have not even had any conversation on that, but I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there
Они, конечно, хотят вернуться в свою историю.
wanted to get back to their historical land.
Свою историю отвлекусь.
Moreover, I would like to share a very interesting story with you.
Значит, где-то в начале
I digress, it's a personal one.
из
Somewhere in the early 80s, I went on a road trip in a car from then Leningrad across the Soviet Union through Kiev. Made a stop in Kiev and then went to western Ukraine. I went to the town of Beregovoye, and all the names of towns and villages there were in Russian and in a language I did not understand, in Hungarian, in Russian and in Hungarian. Not in Ukrainian, in Russian and in Hungarian. I was driving through some kind of village and there were men sitting next to the houses and they were wearing black three-piece suits and black cylinder hats. I asked, are they some kind of entertainers? I was told, no, they were not entertainers, they're Hungarians. I said, what are they doing here? What do you mean? This is their land, they live here. This was during the Soviet time in the 1980s. They preserved the Hungarian language, Hungarian names, and all their national costumes. They are Hungarians and they feel themselves to be Hungarians. And of course, when now there is an infringement.
Well, that is, and there's a lot of that, though. I think many nations are upset about Transylvania as well, as you obviously know. But many nations feel frustrated by the redrawn borders of the wars of the 20th century and wars going back 1,000 years, the ones that you mentioned. But the fact is that you didn't make this case in public until 2 years ago, February. And in the case that you made, which I read today, you explain at great length that you felt a physical threat from the West in NATO, including potentially a nuclear threat, and that's what got you to move. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
Я понимаю, что поскольку мои длинные диалоги, они...
I understand that my long speeches probably fall outside of the genre of the interview. That is why I asked you at the beginning, are we going to have a serious talk or a show?
Так что я обижаюсь.
You said a serious talk. So bear with me, please. We're coming to the point where the Soviet Ukraine was established. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and everything that Russia had generously bestowed on Ukraine was dragged away by the latter. I'm coming to a very important point of today's agenda.
Этот развал Советского Союза.
Thank you.
After all, the collapse of the Soviet Union was effectively initiated by the Russian
Я не
leadership.
знаю, чем тогда руководство России. Но
I do not understand what the Russian leadership was guided by at the time, but I suspect there were several reasons to think everything would be fine.
первое, ну, во-первых, я думаю, что руководство России исходило из того, что фундаментально
First, I think that then Russian leadership believed that the fundamentals of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine were, in fact, a common language. More than 90% of the population there spoke Russian. Family ties. Every third person there had some kind of family or friendship ties. Common culture, common history. Finally, common faith, coexistence with a single state for centuries, and deeply interconnected economies.
Экономика очень сильно взаимосвязана.
All of these were so fundamental. All these elements together make our good relationships inevitable.
Я хочу, чтобы вы, как американские граждане, чтобы
The second point is a very important one.
прежнее российское руководство
I want you, as an American citizen, and your viewers to hear about this as well.
больше никаких разделений.
The former Russian leadership assumed that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and therefore there were no longer any ideological dividing lines.
Инициативно пошло даже на развал Советского Союза.
Russia even agreed voluntarily and proactively to the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Называемым
and believed that this would be understood by the so-called civilized West
союзничеством,
as an invitation for cooperation and
чего
association.
ожидала Россия.
That is what Russia was expecting, both from the United States and the so-called collective West as a whole.
В том числе и в Германии. Эгон Барр.
There were smart people, including in Germany, Egon Bahr, a major politician of the Social Democratic Party, who insisted in his personal conversations with the Soviet leadership on the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union that a new security system should be established in Europe.
Помочь объединиться Германии. Но
Help should be given to unify Germany,
Соединенные
but a
Штаты
new system should be also established to include the United States, Canada, Russia, and other Central European countries.
Yes.
But NATO needs not to expand.
Все будет то же
That's what he
самое.
said. If NATO expands, everything would be just the same as during the Cold War,
Его никто не
only closer to Russia's borders. That's all.
слушал. Больше того, он рассердился как-то.
He was a wise old man, but no one listened to
Если
him.
бы
In fact, he got angry once.
рассердился на советское руководство.
If, he said, you don't listen to me, I'm never setting my foot in Moscow once again.
Но, тем не менее,
Everything happened just as he had said.
Yeah, well, of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. That the opposite happened, but you've never explained why you think that happened.
Yeah, when a nation collapsed, they find someone or somebody to blame that's essentially not them, and they try to obfuscate their part in their own downfall, which is a reasonable thing to believe. When you're poor and you have no money, you think that all the people above you are responsible for it. It happens. It's a common complex that you will see all over the world. I'm still trying to find out the point to which he gets to where he talks about why exactly he invaded, because Tucker brings it up frequently that he didn't bring this up the 23 years or so that he's been in office.
Except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia, do you think, convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion population, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds, or 5% a year. It used to be even more. But that's enough for China. As Bismarck once put it, potentials are the most important. China's potential is enormous. It is the biggest economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy. It has already overtaken the United States quite a long time ago, and it is growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom. Let's not reason in such terms. And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. The trick is, I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there is no communist party power. Let's negotiate. Moreover, I have also said this publicly before.
Был момент, когда
There was a moment when
серая кошка пробежала.
a certain rift started growing between us.
Помните условия?
Before that, Yeltsin came to the United States. Remember, he spoke in Congress and said the good words. God bless America. Everything he said were signals. Let us in. Remember the developments in Yugoslavia before the Yeltsin was lavished with praise? As soon as the developments in Yugoslavia started, he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but raise our voices for Serbs in their defense. I understand that there were complex processes underway there. I do. But Russia could not help raising its voice in support of Serbs, because Serbs are also a special and close to us nation, with Orthodox culture and so on. It's a nation that has suffered so much for generations. Well, regardless, what is important is that Yeltsin expressed his support. What did the United States do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. It was the United States that let the genie out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia protested and expressed its resentment, what was said? The UN Charter and international law have become obsolete. Now everyone invokes international law, but at that time they started saying that everything was outdated. Everything had to be changed. Indeed, some things need to be changed, as the balance of power has changed. It's true, but not in this manner. Yeltsin was immediately dragged through the mud, accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing, of knowing nothing.
Ну хорошо.
He understood everything, I assure you. Well,
Думаю, ладно, все.
I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, the Yugoslav issue is over, but we should try to restore relations.
Которую Россия.
Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through.
Больше того,
And moreover, I said it publicly, I can't reiterate.
с уходящим властителем.
At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him,
Если бы Россия поставила вопрос о вступлении в НАТО,
Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen?
он сказал, ты знаешь, это интересно.
Suddenly he said, you know, it's interesting. I think so.
Уже
But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, you know, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now.
спросите меня. Я думаю, наши
Oh shit! I didn't know Russia tried to join NATO. If that would have happened, things would have been completely different now. And I wonder why NATO didn't accept them.
You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview. He'll confirm it.
подобную
I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened. Okay.
Were you
It's
sincere?
impossible now.
Would you have joined NATO?
Послушайте,
Look, I asked the question, is it possible or not? And the answer I got was no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out what the leadership position was,
Yeah, he wouldn't
But
have
if he had
asked.
said yes, would you have joined NATO?
если бы он
if he had said yes, the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and eventually it might have happened if we had seen some sincere wish on the other side of our partners. But it didn't happen. Well, no means no. Okay, fine.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive, I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
That's a good question. Because I mean, I was like 9 years old when this all happened, but that's a good question. Why did NATO reject them when it would have been beneficial for everybody to have Russia be a part of NATO?
Вы сказали, что
You said I was bitter about the answer. No, it's not bitterness. It's just a statement of fact. We're not bride and groom, bitterness, resentment. It's not about those kind of matters in such circumstances. We just realized we weren't welcome there, that's all. Okay, fine. But let's build relations in another manner. Let's look for common ground elsewhere. Why we received such a negative response, you should ask your leaders. I can only guess why. Too big a country with its own opinion and so on. And the United States, I've seen how issues are being resolved in NATO.
ну, я же видел, как
I
решают.
will give you another example now concerning Ukraine.
Один из примеров сейчас приведу, касающийся.
The US leadership exerts pressure, and all NATO members obediently vote,
Даже если им
even if they do not like something.
скажу, что происходило с Украиной.
Now, I'll tell you what happened in this regard with Ukraine in 2008, although it's being discussed. I'm not going to open a secret to you, say anything new.
По-разному выстроить отношения.
Nevertheless, after that we tried to build relations in different ways.
События.
For example, the events in the Middle East, in Iraq.
Мы
We
очень
were building relations with the United States in a very soft, prudent, cautious manner. I repeatedly raised the issue that the United States should not support separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus,
первым Кавказе. Но все равно продолжали
but they continue to do it anyway.
политические
And political support, information support, financial support,
Даже
even military support came from the United States and its satellites for terrorist groups in the Caucasus.
формировать была
I once raised this issue with my colleague, also the President of the United States. He says, "It's impossible. Do you have proof?" I said, "Yes." I was prepared for this conversation, and I gave him that proof. He looked at it, and you know what he said? I apologize, but that's what happened. I'll quote. He says, "Well, I'm gonna kick their ass." We waited and waited for some response. There was no reply.
Я говорю директору.
I said to the FSB director, write to the CIA, what is the result of the conversation with President? He wrote once, twice, and then we got a reply. We have the answer in the archive. The CIA replied, we have been working with the opposition in Russia. We believe that this is the right thing to do, and we will keep on doing it. Just ridiculous. Well, okay. We realized that it was out of the question.
Forces in opposition to you. So you're saying the CIA is trying to overthrow your government.
Ну, конечно, имелось в виду в данном
Of
случае.
course, they meant in that particular case the separatists, the terrorists who fought with us in the Caucasus.
Ah, okay.
That's who they called the opposition.
Это вот второй момент.
This is the second
Очень
point.
важный.
The third moment is a very important one. Is the moment when the US missile defense system was created.
Начало.
The beginning.
И мы долго уговаривали.
We persuaded for a long time not to do it in the United States.
Меня пригласили в
Moreover,
отец Буша
after was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean,
Там состоялась очень серьезная беседа,
I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team.
чтобы
I proposed that the United States, Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that we believe,
мы считаем,
if created unilaterally, threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was being created against missile threats from Iran. That was the justification for the deployment of the missile defense system. I suggested working together, Russia, the United States, and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I said, "Absolutely."
Let me ask, what year was this?
ну, я не помню, вот
I don't remember.
в интернете, когда я был.
It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of Bush Sr. It is even easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about.
Они сказали, это очень интересно.
I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together.
Нет,
The world will change.
споров,
We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, "Are you serious?" I said, "Of course. We need to think about it." And so
Вот в этот кабинет
I said, "Go ahead, please." Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came in here in this cabinet, right here at this table. They sat on this table. Me,
I don't think Tucker's offering enough pushback. I know that this is a long-winded, basically history lesson about how the modern conflict came to be, but I'd like to see Tucker push back a little bit on some of the claims that he's making. Some of these, like, I don't know if you'd ever forget something like that being denied, this missile defense system. If the missile defense system you thought was so important, you would absolutely remember that day, and you'd probably made some note of it or made some kind of speech about it as to why not only you're not a part of NATO, but why the United States government. And I'm not saying that we're always right as the U.S. government, but I think that if you have to have the receipts of when these things happen. Yeah, you could have been in the United States and talked with Bush Sr., but it doesn't mean that what you say is necessarily true.